Hi, everybody. Welcome to Union Fees, Unraveling the Mystery. The idea for this panel came from a conversation that was happening on Sync This, and I see from the people that came in, there's a lot of Sync This people that came on. Basically, what happened is the music supervisor was talking about how she saved the producer money because she discovered that the master that they were about to pay union fees on was a UK master. And it started a discussion, well, what if that wasn't all recorded in the UK and jurisdiction issues with union? And I realized that all this confusion I had over union fees was something shared by far too many people in the music supervision world and beyond. And that would be really helpful if we had a panel. And initially, I was just going to do this panel myself for the group of people that I knew on Sync This. But literally in the course of 24 hours, over 140 people RSVP'd to see this panel. And it became clear that we needed somebody like the Guild of Music Supervisors to help us reach a larger audience. And the Guild reached out, they wanted to help. It's the East Coast version of the Guild that's led by Ed and Patricia Joseph and Al Risi. And we're very excited to be able to do this panel. But tonight, we hope to answer a lot of your questions. There's a handout that I believe was just pinned in the chat. And it's also one we're going to be talking about on actually how you calculate union fees. But this is the beginning of a conversation that is really complicated. And it's likely that we're probably going to have a couple more panels. And hopefully one of those panels will include people from the unions who have to come here and answer our difficult questions. Tonight, what we did was I invited two colleagues of mine who I've known for decades, literally, who really know this from the other side. They're licensing people, they're music supervision people, and they've worked in a variety of areas that make them experts in this area. So first, I'd like to introduce Loriana Zuluaga to tell us a little bit about her background.
Hi, everyone. I've been in the industry for a really long time now, I guess. I still feel like I'm a newbie because everything changes and I'm always learning no matter where I am. But I started off as a performer touring. Then I jumped over to a company that I didn't know existed called the Music House. It was called Tom and Andy, one of the premier music houses at the time. I learned that side of the business, jumping over to an ad agency and became a music producer at Gray Worldwide. And from there, I found myself diving into licensed music and really enjoying what that was. And I moved over to Sony Music for a few years and then decided I wanted to learn something else. And I learned about the publishing side at BMG and went on the indie side following that and jumped back into the ad agency world. And now I'm at Secret Road repping independent catalog.
Great. And our next panelist is Celeste Chada. And I've known Celeste actually since the 90s when she was licensing at Spelling Entertainment. So we've been through the battleground together for a while. Celeste, why don't you tell everybody your very diverse background?
It's been a very long road. Not a secret road, but a very long road. I did get my start in licensing and clearance, and it was, really fascinating to me anytime. My entire experience really is on the studio side, so I bring that unique experience. But when rights were being analyzed for whether something could be exploited, they were like, "Oh, music, we'll just deal with that later." Like no one ever wanted to get into this. And I thought, boy, that's really strange that no one ever wants to talk about music or really couldn't competently, even like really, experienced lawyers who were in the labor department or the music lawyers. So I thought that I have to learn about this. And I went to work then at Fox in their legal affairs department. And as these things change, so do they say the same, that the licensing and clearance really lent itself to production. So then I started getting into film and music production for on-camera singing or any kind of, instrument or any band that you would see or any kind of singing. which then, lends itself to big songs being produced. And it's sort of like the rabbit hole vortex that you fall into and can never pull yourself out of. It's just a great love, great respect for so many of the people I see on this, here at this talk, and really can't wait to get into this discussion.
Just a little on my background. I've been a music supervisor for film, television, and Broadway, as well as a music publisher. For 27 years, I ran a company called Next Decade Entertainment, which was an independent administration company. And my clients included Boston, Harry Belafonte, Vic Mizzy, who wrote the Addams Family theme, and many others. And in 2018, I left Next Decade for whatever my next adventure was going to be. And that has now turned into my new company, which is called Go to 11 Entertainment. And it's an equity-funded music publishing company that's female-led and focusing on female creators, although we're also signing many men who co-write and produce with our female creators. And we're hoping to finish our first close on our fund in the fall and start onboarding the clients that we've signed. So hoping to work with many of you in this room on lots of different projects. So just to give you some context of the changes that have happened in union fees, wanted to just explain a little bit about why we believe that it's now so much more complicated. In the 90s, when all of us kind of began in the business, obviously there was no digital. And so licenses were very straightforward for film and television and advertising. Basically, people asked for a certain amount of rights in a certain territory. There was no additional rights or multimedia issues. And the union fee process was a little bit more straightforward. Fast forward to the 2000s, when the music industry basically fell apart because of digital. And obviously union fees shifted a lot in that painful period when we were all trying to figure out how we were going to keep this thing going. And then in 2012, a very pivotal point happened, and that was the merger of SAG and AFTRA. Before that, AFTRA was the organization that took care of vocal union fees. And when they merged, that changed the clientele that were, or the people at SAG AFTRA that were taking care of these licenses. And so what's happened now is we have a healthier business. We have all these streaming services. We have regular television and all the movies and everything else. There's more content being created now, more music supervision going on. And yet the unions really have very small staffs. At SAG-AFTRA, there's really only 2 people that you can talk to for most of the reuse fee issues. And at AFFM, there's 3 people. So if you consider thousands of songs that get licensed over the course of a year by all the people in this room, and only 5 people are handling these union issues, you can begin to understand why this has become so complicated. So in putting this together, I spoke with lots of different people about issues that they had with the unions and issues that they've had in trying to be good music supervisors. Because at the end of the day, it's not just this big bad union situation. What the unions represent is all of the singers and all of the musicians that are played on these masters that we're licensing getting compensated for the uses. And we need to find a way to facilitate that so it's better for us to do our jobs. It's not as complicated. And also so that those people start to get paid sooner than the 2 to 3 years it now takes the union to invoice the studios and the labels to get those licensing fees paid to the different people that are members of the unions. So I'd like to start talking about jurisdiction issues for all of these things, for film and television and advertising. So how do you define the territory that includes the jurisdiction of the unions here in the US? Loriana?
The way it's always worked on the advertising side is a production is being created by a signatory agency. That means an agency that made a commitment to the union and its members to pull from this pool of talent. If they're producing work sourcing from the US, that's the jurisdiction. If it's something is being filmed ex-US, that's not the jurisdiction. That's how it's always been.
Right.
I mean, it differs a bit on a studio side. A studio, the production company will be almost always SAG for almost all purposes. Sometimes, but not always, AFM. So that's when it gets a little bit tricky. If a song is created for a film in the United States and the production company is not a signatory to the AFM, then the singers would be union. The general consensus is that the singers would be union, the musicians would not be. That work could be done anywhere. If the production company is not a signatory, there's no obligation. So the work could be done in Los Angeles. It could be done in, a right to work state like, New Orleans or Tennessee, or it could be done abroad. But as, we have been discussing, and this is something that comes up always, and now even more so with COVID, that everyone is at home, wherever that home may be, or where they're, whatever new home they've adopted. So it adds some new dimensions to this, that if I have a bassist recording something in one jurisdiction and then the vocalist in another jurisdiction, and then orchestral musicians that something is overlaid, there are so many intricate elements that can be present in one master that it does make it really complicated about, like, how do we designate this for future purposes? And of course, you have to deal with that as at the time it's being created, because no one will remember a month later what happened was involved. So, yeah, those are some jurisdiction is a very significant issue.
Yeah. Do you think jurisdiction's getting more tricky now that people are really composing on their computers in 9 locations or more? No?
I feel like it's a tremendous issue. I mean, there are not only jurisdictional issues with respect to that. If you are something that just came up, like a British person who was like living in Los Angeles, but then returned home to the UK for a period of time to deal with family issues because of COVID, who is a union member but rendered services in the UK, the picture is the production entity is a non-signatory, then that work most likely is not going to be union.
Non-union.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, it depends a lot with advertising too. The agency might be signatory, the agency might not be signatory. It really depends on where the track was recorded. So a lot of the times what we do on the pitching and vendor side of things is provide location, recording location, where it was done. But then you also have the situation where Celeste was talking about, where a singer was on vacation in LA and was called to do something and recorded in LA, but they're not US based. They fall into the jurisdiction, and suddenly their track becomes union under union scrutiny if it were picked up by a union shop.
Right. But if you call the union, what will they say about that? What will they tell you? You never know.
You never know. You never know.
Now, do you think that Mexico is considered part of North America?
No. For recording purposes, Mexico is never really an issue. Canada is the big issue because of the Anglo production that happens and the cross pollination of location and filming sites. Mexico, for advertising production, hasn't really been a source location for seasonal work. Vancouver, yes. South Africa, yes. Different locations in Australia, yes. Their landscapes typically look enough like the US for different ads. So not so much Mexico.
The reason I'm asking is because the Latin music has become such a huge part of commercials, and certainly commercials to the Latin community. And those are recorded in Mexico largely.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
I think it's an issue that's probably bubbling up as far as how we're going to have to deal with it and start thinking of Mexico as part of the equation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I used to deal with a lot of norteño music when I was at Sony and through the Latin side. The rules within Latin media are very different from national, like typical broadcast and production. So a commercial created by a US based ad agency versus a multicultural agency at the time, they had, if they were under the umbrella, they still had to adhere to US rules. But if something's recorded in Mexico, it wasn't an issue.
Right. So Celeste touched on what happens if somebody records partially or in the UK and how that's the mix. So Levi, can you bring in Lionel to the mix here? So I invited Lionel Lodge, who some of you might know. Lionel has a new platform called Sync Lodge, which is a platform to help music supervisors. And one of the modules he was working on was one that you would have all loved, that would allow you to literally plug in a master and find out what the union fees would be. But he had some issues trying to get that adopted by the unions, including working with the musicians union in the UK. So Lionel, you want to tell us a little bit about your experience? Oh, you're on, you need to unmute.
Okay, hi. Yes, it was a basic idea that if they have a formulation of how they figure out what the union fees are, no matter how complicated it was, let's put it through an algorithm. Let's figure out a calculation. Let's make it so that this can be, if a music supervisor is looking at 20 songs and maybe they're going to pick one for a spot, let's not talk to the union about all those other 19. Let's just give them a calculation and give them an idea what it's going to cost. And we spent quite a few months and a lot of money on actually building these calculators, and we presented it to the unions. And the basic feeling that came back to us was that we were going to take away their authority. And this was a bit a thing that I had a hard time getting my head around. But it's from my perspective. I come from a creative side as well as the business side, and I just thought, why are they doing this when they're undermining their members, their revenue flow of their members? They're overcomplicating for the music supervisors in this day and age. If we can build something that makes it so it's simpler for everybody, then this should work. The MU in the UK were the most open about it. And they are actually, from our experience, we've dealt with, from the International Federation for Musicians Unions, we've dealt with over 70 unions in the last 3 years we've talked to. And the AFM, SAG-AFTRA, and the CFM, which is a branch of the AFM, were the most difficult for us to deal with. And I didn't really understand that. We're still knocking, though. We're still there knocking on their door.
If you have a mix of a UK artist, either whether it's a singer or a musician on a master, how do you deal with that? Both of you. How do you deal with it in advertising first, Loriana?
Well, a long time ago, when I was at Grey Worldwide, there's a Pantene commercial. And this is like the old story that comes out of the hat. There's a Pantene commercial that used Natasha Bedingfield's song. There was the understanding that she is a UK artist. So we were able to provide, I wasn't there at the time. I was literally crossing from Grey Worldwide over to Sony at this time while it was all going on. But it was like, the big SAG conundrum that happened is her vocals for this song Unwritten were actually recorded in LA. All of a sudden, the production blew up. Everything had to stop, because it became financially not possible to use this song. The license itself, both the publishing side and the master side, approved a certain fee, but the SAG costs were not quantified or calculated within this, because at the time, it's always been that a SAG budget is completely separate from a license. two separate entities. Like you had the talent department dealing solely with any talent, and SAG is considered talent. A vocal is considered talent. It's not considered music. It's not considered part of the music budget. So it was always a separate like thing that comes back and goes, hi, surprise, this is going to potentially make this cost prohibitive. So, agency had to think fast and try to figure it out. And they fixed it, which was, magic. They were able to have her re-record the song in her jurisdiction or in her home studio, and they were able to salvage it. But there was one of those things that surprise costs that you can't account for, that you can't quantify, while you're putting numbers together without a talent department giving you those numbers of potential costs. You really don't know what to tell your brand, how much that's going to cost. Like it could be $1 million in vocal reuse fees that a brand can't afford. So you just don't know. So you have to make sure there are protections in place to make sure all the due diligence is done as thoroughly as possible to provide the accurate metadata. Now it's called metadata. Now we have a word for it that is like, sounds all sexy. But at the time it was just like, you had to rely on liner notes. You had to go into the CD, you had to go into the tape. Somebody might've had an old record player with, or an old record with the recording location on the bottom. That's really all you had to go along with. But
we don't have that now. So what do
we don't have that? We rely on having the proper metadata. When a new song is delivered, we need to know everything. We need to know. I now ask artists if they're SAG. It's like, I need to know this ahead of time. Do you know if you are SAG or not? And oftentimes artists don't necessarily know because, people think that their membership lapses if they were signed to a major and then they are no longer on a major. They were grandfathered into SAG through the SAG-AFTRA agreement. So the big majors that let their artists go, these artists are stuck with a SAG membership if they've done a successful, if they've had a successful history of licensing. So it's you have to provide all the information. You have to cross all your T's and dot all your I's in order to make the job as easy as possible. Recording location, who sang the background vocals, are the background vocals sweetened versus doubled? Like you have to know so much more than you've ever had to know before in order to make, our clients' lives easier.
What about on the film television side? If you have sort of this cross-country master situation?
We do all the time. I mean, it really is almost always strategic though, because film stuff takes a lot longer to get done than ad stuff. I mean, like for sure, I've been involved in some ads and wow, you guys work fast. I mean, we work, it's rough, but it's slow, put it that way. So, you can tell if a director is really cannot live without some song, and we, through some investigation, figure out that the reuse is going to be staggering, we'll either try to negotiate to clear the sync separately with the right to re-record it and then re-record it, or, just completely re-record everything, which no one ever wants to do. But when you've got, a pop song with a bit of orchestral overlay, and that turns out to be 50 players, could be
not going to work.
A couple $100,000, and that is never going to work for a film budget. It's just much easier to re-record. So what we'll do in that case is somebody will run to Budapest or someone will run to the UK. And, but again, as we're discussing, you have to be so very careful about all of the elements that end up in the final master, like controlling the engineers very carefully to say, what exactly is in this master? Because someone who is involved in, the original song will hear it in a minute, that you have to be careful that all of the new vocals are clean, all of the new re-recorded, musicians are clean too. Just as you were saying, you've got to provide the venue, you've got to really, people don't do this anymore in the days of Zoom, but being in the room really helps to understand what is happening and what elements end up in there. But yeah, I mean, it's, We have a lot more time to deal with it in film, but it arises probably in every movie that's produced.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a pre-existing master, if it's a licensed master, I think what's happening, at least for me, is getting harder to understand where is the recording, because people don't record in one place anymore. They don't go to a studio. They do their part in their home studio and they send it along to the next person on their computer. So if one of those people is in a right to work state, like you were saying, Celeste, you were talking about Nashville. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about right to work states and how that helps with whether union or non-union. Wait, we can't hear you. Your mic's, you're off.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I tend to always take the most conservative approach because I am always working for the studios, and that there's, the downside is enormous, at least from our perspective. So if the production entity is a signatory, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that no matter where it is, no matter where the contribution is recorded, that we somehow try to paper these folks or make the entire master union, because it's just the exposure is just too much, because injunctive relief is, the for real alternative, and nobody wants that. So that's my approach, and that's by no means a consensus, or we wouldn't even be having this discussion. But when people say, how is there a way around this? The answer, if the production entity is a signatory, is always no. Of course not. We got to work it out.
All right, so we have some good questions, so I feel like I have to sort of jump in with these. So Kelly Bond asks, I think she's asking just to make sure we help everybody understand, what's the distinction between a union-covered production / ad versus a union-covered recording controlled by a label signatory? Loriana.
That's me. So much in that question. So a signatory ad agency working on a production has the ability to work with a non-union track. They're not obligated to limit what they use, but they are limited to the parts of the song. So if you have an ad for a signatory or an ad for a signatory agency using a non-signatory band, that vocalist has the potential to have to become a SAG member, depending on if they get a Taft-Hartley. And for anybody who doesn't know Taft-Hartley, a Taft-Hartley is, going back to old union laws, a Taft-Hartley is, some points you start building in order to become a SAG member or a union member. So I had my Taft-Hartley first when I was 5 years old for something that I don't even remember doing as like a child actor. I think it was a Care Bears or a Hot Wheels commercial. So that shows my age. And I have no idea if I was on camera. My dad taped all our videos over with boxing matches, so I don't have any proof. But years later, that came to bite me in the rear when I worked at a music house and somebody needed a fast vocal. And I was like, you know what, I'll do it. I got nothing else to do. I'm talking to people all day long. I can sing that. I got it. I got a spot. I think it was for a CoverGirl commercial or some other thing. And it was through a union shop or a union agency that required anybody who was participating to become a member, or you get a Taft-Hartley. And I already had a Taft-Hartley that followed me. I was obligated to become, or else it wouldn't happen and the spot would have blown up and I would have ruined an entire production. So I joined the union. The opposite is when you have a signatory song from a signatory label being licensed from a non-signatory agency can sometimes blow an entire production up. A lot of the times the non-signatory agencies don't necessarily know the union laws because they don't have to. But oftentimes they suddenly have to learn it really quickly in order to not completely blow up a production and kill a relationship with a brand partner. So oftentimes you pull the vocal. You don't use the vocal, you don't have to worry about it. But there potentially may or may not be AFM situations involved or obligations to that, because most agencies generally aren't signatories to the AFM unless they're doing like a work for hire or custom work where like those session players are called from the union and they need to be paid.
You think this trend of less vocals in commercials is in direct relationship to this change with the union rules?
That actually started in, we were as far back as like 2006, 2008, when the recession was going through and ripped through the industry. It ripped through the music industry, but it also ripped through the ad industry because suddenly they had to save and make productions on shoestring budgets. And no matter, how far into the history of advertising you go, the way to, find extra money was look in the music budget. Music used to be always like, unless it was completely detrimental to the production, like if it was, a parody vocal on some famous song like Swiffer using Whip It by Devo for, Swift It, or like some old Johnny Nash song, like for a Windex commercial, that was like very important and core to the creative. If music is an arbitrary last minute thing, they don't want to spend money on music, so they don't have to. They can go to the libraries and spend a fraction of the price of what they would pay normally, and it's a one stop.
Okay, another question that seems to be popular is this combination of union, non-union issues. So if an ad production company that is a non-signatory and licenses a pre-recorded song, are they a pre-recorded song that is a signatory master? So say that master comes from a major label. Mm-hmm. Are they obligated to pay SAG and AFM union fees?
But here's the other problem. MFN can potentially affect the entire production. So if you have a union vocal on a non-union spot, suddenly your status as a production changes through MFN. So that means people on camera have to get paid as a union artist.
So it makes everything union, and then that blows the budget.
The voiceover, it can kill it. It can kill a production. So as a vendor, I have two obligations. Without advertising, without brands, I don't have a business. Without artists, I don't have a business. I don't exist without bands. I don't exist without brands. So I have to have a mutual respect for agencies and how they produce, which I have to say, being on the agency side twice and being on a vendor side multiple times in different levels. So being at a music house, providing one side of the business, a master's at a major, publishing, and at an indie, you get a perspective from all points. So I really, like Celeste, I sympathize with my brands. I sympathize with the ad agencies because that job is not easy. And in some of the reasons why I've left, it was just, the work is just, it is grueling. When you think you have sold a song to somebody and has sold the entire brand, last minute, they're like, no one's it. That it hurts. But losing out on a project because they can't afford the SAG reuse fees, that hurts even harder because now I can't pay my indie band. My indie band isn't getting income. And the additional SAG reuse stuff, that's just gravy. Like, they don't rely on that. They like the sync fee, the license fee is what keeps the lights on.
Right. So it sounds like, Celeste, in film and television, that because the studios are primarily all signatories, that the union rules for film and television are a little clearer. Is that true, or am I just hopeful?
No, I mean, I think there's confusion always when we approach these. We approach these issues because you come together with the creative vision of a director, of the producers. Then you'll have the internal music supervisor, sometimes external music supervisors. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, pitching different kinds of songs and vibes, and so the music will come from anywhere. There are like typical pop tunes to like really obscure recordings that, we can't even, locate some of the syncs. I do think that you really can't get around this issue though, with the major motion picture studios, at least, that if you are a signatory, you should record in Los Angeles Union. However, there are instances in which a signatory company goes abroad and does all of the music abroad. But the most conservative approach is if you start AFM, you stay AFM. It's almost always going to be SAG. I mean, truly, our talent, even if they are rendering services in Romania, I mean, you're hiring Americans who are working there. So, SAG will attach at that point. But it's highly possible and, sometimes inevitable that by the time you get through VFX and everything else, the music budget seems to be this pot of gold at the end of the filmmaking process that everyone is like, wait a minute, we had $1 million here. Like, we could use that money somewhere else. And then suddenly your budget slashed and you've got to make do with it. So you go to a non-union venue. Another unfortunate thing that kind of drives this for the film studios is if you've got a composer that would like to release a record. So, that film to album conversion cost definitely drives the way, or doesn't drive, but it can inform the way the music within the body of the film is recorded, if that is a goal. And, let's face it, of course, it's a terrific tool for composers to use. And, everyone loves to have, a score record. So, I guess that's a very long way of saying there's many different ways. I wish there was a uniform approach, but if you are, the most conservative way of approaching it is if you are involving a union at some point in the process, be uniform in your approach and involve the union in all of the process. That is going to be the safest way to avoid any trouble down the road.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think SAG has been getting wise to the change in the industry, thankfully, with social media, especially for ads. When I was still on the ad side, I think at the time they were talking about being able to renegotiate and negotiate with talent on productions that were below $50,000. And now we know that the way COVID has affected, the media landscape, you're now able to make things with tastemakers. And now tastemakers have this really open-ended SAG contract now that's being figured out. It's not perfect, but things are constantly changing. But what I find is the biggest hurdle is not only is the information not getting out to the agencies sometimes, the information is not getting out to music supervisors and music producers. And it's all about trying to ask as many people as possible to find out what the latest news is, because they don't make it easy to find the information.
Yes, that seemed to be across the board. The number one thing everybody said is very hard to get solid information that makes you feel confident, what the union fees are going to be in the grand scheme of the budget, especially because most of these fees are not invoiced by the union until 2 to 3 years after a production is fully closed. And that means that the union members, all these singers and musicians, they're not getting paid 2 to 3 or more years, because after they're invoiced after the 2 to 3 years, then they have to be collected. And the studios, they're not the fastest payers on the planet either. So that process is basically stringing out how all those creators get paid in this very difficult time for creators.
Yeah.
So before I don't want to run out of time, all of you have this handout. It's pinned in the chat. If you watch this video on YouTube, there'll be access. There's a link on the Guild of Music Supervisors website. This is sort of a compendium of how you figure out the fees. So for a domestic new use in a film or television production, including promos, that is less than $7,500, the fees have been made much easier. And this happened after the SAG-AFTRA merger. So basically you figure out what those fees for SAG-AFTRA, it's 7% of the license fee for anything under $7,500, and with a minimum of $165. And then you have to add in the health and retirement. So at SAG-AFTRA, apparently their health and retirement is a little less than the AFM. So that fee is 12.75% times whatever the fee was, that was the 7% of the license fee. And what happens is the label will calculate what is owed and send an invoice to the licensee, which ostensibly is the producer of either the commercial or the film or television project. In this case, it's film or television. And the licensee will pay the label, and the label will remit it to the union. So on the bottom here, you see how that's calculated for a $5,000 license. And you can see basically what those fees are, as opposed to, say, a $500 license. But even in a $500 license, remember, there's a minimum of $165. So you're always going to have to pay that. On AFM, the formula is basically the same. It's just that their pension fund is a little bigger. And so they get a little bit more money on the pension fund. I'm not sure what the connection is that musicians need more money in their pension than singers, but whatever. So next is when you have a film or television production with a license that is over $7,500, and this is the wild card. This is where everybody's getting tripped up, because that calculation is based on what is in that master. And the only way you can find that out is if you contact the union. And in here, we have the address where you can contact the union, but many people will tell you that that takes a lot of time, and it takes more time for some people than others. And this is where it's a huge problem for supervisors, especially, say, if you're doing an on-camera use and you've got to know, like, what is the budget? What are you going to have to pay if you use this song in an on-camera use that the director definitely wants to shoot in 24 hours? Do you guys have any ideas of like how to deal with a situation like that?
You have to earmark the money in the budget. I mean, until it can resolve. I mean, hopefully you wouldn't be dealing with it like the day before you're shooting something, but it's always completely prudent to put that money aside just until you can figure it.
Right.
I mean, because the really important part about this, and and this is so helpful, is that if you are signing a license for a label that is a signatory, this language is now part of your license. You are affirmatively like agreeing to pay all of this. So that is very important.
Do you find that the labels can ever help you with some kind of estimate on like at least the number of people on the track? No. Everybody's saying no.
And I'd like to. I think they would. I think if there was a way that they could figure, if they had the information, I think they would share it. But again, nobody. This is the difficulty regarding privity between all of these organizations. It's like you're going to rely on information from Universal Records that this number is correct to make a deal between Netflix and the union. Like it's what if they're wrong? Or it's just human error. There's just too many. Mm-hmm. There really does need to be some ability, some central source of information, and there just isn't. And I do think that the labels would love to give us this info if they could, but where would they get it from? How would they know?
Yeah.
Lionel, can you talk? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, in all the years that I've been pitching music to ads and licensing music for ads, I've never been able to provide an AFM report on a pre-recorded song. As a music house, that was part of it. That was like, okay, here's your composer, here's your leader. Could you ever imagine like Joey Ramone and the rest of the Ramones trying to decide who was the composer, the leader, or the no bands would exist.
Lionel, can you talk a little bit about the data situation you were told about, like sort of some, finding data, accessing data about
Well,
all
yeah,
the musicians?
we went through SAG-AFTRA and the AFM. We went through all their contractual elements for how they figure out their new usage fees, and we spent months on this. We had some legal people working through this. It was very complicated, and one of the points was, okay, so where is your database of recordings? Where are you when if I put the song to you and say I want to use this, where are you getting the information of who played on it? And they told us that from somewhere around 2006, 2008, they started building a digital database. Before that, they have scans of contracts, whether PDFs or their scans, but they have to look at those. And that goes back about 15 years. Before that, they have paper. And sometimes they have to phone the office in Austin and ask them to go downstairs and look into a filing cabinet and pull out a file, and hopefully the information is there. And it is staggering how it actually stops the rest of the industry from working. That these unions that do have the finances to go through this, and I think it's their obligation to go through this, that it should be a lot more clear, it should be a lot more straight, and it shouldn't be something where the music supervisors or the artists are losing out just because this data is not clear. And in every other industry in the world, if you don't have your data together, then you are the one that's losing out, not the person that's trying to actually deal with you, right? This is one of the frustrating things. Because
as Celeste and Loriana said, like if you can't find the rights, or if there is a problem, your song will be replaced.
Yeah.
So the data. So if you picked a master and the only data that exists at the union is in some card catalog in Austin, Texas, and it's going to take them, however many days or weeks to find it, that could preclude that master from being in a production.
Most people don't have the time, right? They just go, okay, we can't do that.
I used to rely on a really great team of archivists at one point to get, who knew just randomly they knew some data. And then you'd have to go through legal to clear that information before you could send it over to your supervisor. And by that time, they've moved on. But, it's such a shame that these, so many great songs are not out. They didn't make it to that final mix because of just some data that was missing.
Now, but what about vocal?
It's shameful.
Yeah,
I think.
What about vocal consent issues? So this was another thing that was brought up to me. Label pitches a master for production. Everybody likes it. I think it was commercial, and comes to the consent form. So the unions require written consent, correct? For a vocalist, especially for a commercial, they want you to sign off. So this master was from the 1950s. Every singer was dead in this particular master. And the union told the label that they would have to get consent from each estate of each dead singer, at which point the label said, we can't do that. Like, we're just not going to be able to do that. And the master wasn't used. So have you had these kinds of consent issues in productions that you've been involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the other side of the coin is like trying to find the proper next of kin. Like we would try to track that down as a courtesy for some of our agency clients, because they needed help. Without that clearance, we wouldn't have had the deal, or we wouldn't be able to make the deal if we didn't put in the legwork to try to find it. And at the same time, at that time, this is pre-SAG-AFTRA, the labels didn't collect. So they were just like, it's not really our problem. We don't do this. But me being like a former agency person and also a SAG member, is like, I gotta, like, without this, like, it's, who do they have to go to? I'm the only person that can help.
Right.
So you'd call, you'd try, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. And you can't really put money into escrow and being like, well, someday if they come around, we'll give them money from our escrow account. Like, you can't do that.
No.
And it's a consent issue. I mean, like that has to be affirmative too. Like you can't be guessing. And I mean, it's the couple of times that I've been involved with that, it's an issue where you end up talking to a lawyer who you haven't engaged, and like they might pass the message on to the family, but they don't really have a big incentive to like help connect you with the heirs to get all of the, to get all of this buttoned down. It just is it's a dead end, or it quickly becomes a dead end. And it's sad. It's unfortunate because it's affects so many really rad, interesting recordings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually discovered this when we took over the Boston catalog literally 3 weeks after Brad Delp committed suicide. And I'd been licensing masters all over the place and didn't know that the kids had never signed up with SAG-AFTRA. And it became, apparent in a commercial. And so I finally got them signed up, and all this money got released to them that had been on hold for the estate. So, I mean, it's something publishers could help with as well. If they're involved, as and labels, like if you know that a creator that's in your catalog has passed away and you're dealing with their heirs, this is something you need to connect them with, is having them sign up with the unions as an heir.
Yeah.
Okay, so next is commercials. And again, this is something that you can't really figure out on your own. You have to contact the union. So we have the contacts for the unions where you can write to. And there are some materials on the union sites, but you kind of have to dig through a lot of different fields to get to this applicable scale description, and it will make your head explode. So I would just say write to the union and ask them what the fee will be. So for video games, this actually was the most confounding thing in this whole situation. I don't think the video game fees make any sense, especially if the video game is a royalty-bearing game. So apparently the story behind how these came about was that these new rates came about when Rock Band and Guitar Hero were in the video game space. Those two games were a complete enigma. We had never had anything like them before that, and we've had nothing like that since, save the game Just Dance, which I fortunately had a song on, which was fabulous. But if it's a royalty-bearing video game, they want you to figure out the union fees by taking 5 quarters of royalty statements to average what your earnings are. I don't know who's doing this. I mean, I have no idea who's figuring out that video game rate. I would love to talk to the union about this and see how many people actually pay this royalty-bearing video game rate, because I don't think it's happening.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know anybody that's figuring that out. But again, I'm on the publishing side. I'm not on the master side. So maybe it is happening. I don't know. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is non-traditional use, which means new media and digital. And basically this is the simplest one because it's the newest one. But obviously, digital has been going on for a while. So I guess we should count our blessings that they haven't made it more complicated yet. And that it's basically 3% of the license. So you can see the calculation below. And apparently there is no retirement or healthcare royalty that's attached to a new media license or digital license. So we have a ton of questions and we have 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to just roll through some of these and see how many people we can get through. Whatever we don't answer, I will try to get some answers for everybody, and we'll find a place to put that on the Guild's website. So what are we up to next here? I just got like a whole deluge. Okay. We answered this. Do any of the panelists have any insight about the likelihood of masters derived from live recordings of big bands from the 20s and 40s on radio broadcasts? Would they be subject to union fees?
Oh, I think those are so complicated that nobody would want to touch it. That would be one of those instances where it's like, even having old like Fred Astaire stuff, or like the old TV orchestra shows when you had those existing, like Enda 1, Enda 2, what was his name? Come on, somebody. Doesn't matter, like Benny Goodman or something. Is it the Bubbles guy?
Yeah, the Bubbles.
It's so complicated that, as much as you want to have that happen, those were always instances where you'd call up a music house and say, hey, can you record this and give it some like radio room tone and just, zhuzh it and get some sound design on it and replicate it. Like it becomes like far too complicated for even a record label to try to deal with and clear for you.
Yeah, for sure. On the film side too, like those recordings are charming, but they don't sound great in Atmos. So, I mean, you would most likely clear the sync and then re-record it and give it to some engineer to run it through some digital something that will make it sound old timey and charming again. But at least you know what's in there, and then it can be adapted for film work.
Yeah. And God forbid anybody asks for splits. So
no, my God.
All right. So someone's asking here, so SAG-AFTRA only deals with vocal tracks and not instrumental only tracks. Yeah. So SAG-AFTRA deals with all the vocal issues. So every singer that's in a master, that's a SAG-AFTRA issue. And all the musicians in the master are controlled by the AFM. Sorry, we didn't go there in the beginning. Okay. How do unions really know the extent of a use in the ad world? Do they rely on the agency reporting it, or are there checks and balances?
There are checks and balances. There are organizations that you can register if you're a record label, or if you're a publisher or a sync agency. You can register and have them track it. On the original production side of things, there used to be one person that we would go to as a music house named Ivy Tomback, and you'd send her your ISKI codes, and she would track
an
the
ISKI code.
An ISKI code is similar to an ISRC code, which ISRC code everybody knows is your master tracking number. An ISKI code is a commercial tracking number. So that's applied to when you send your ad for trafficking to broadcast or cable or wherever, you can track it through your ISKI code and see how many times something has aired, or if it's airing along with with your media buy that you purchased as an ad agency.
But the labels and the studios basically have to submit invoices, don't they, for uses?
This is where it's tricky. Now, AFTRA, it's just so you know, AFTRA used to be the radio union. So that was how music got paid for when it was played on radio. And so you had the option to join the AFTRA union, which is, you'd had an option between SAG or AFTRA if you're a vocal talent. If you did more radio work, you'd go for AFTRA. If you did more on-camera talent or like background vocal talent on broadcast cable stuff, you'd go in SAG. Labels never tracked this before. So with the union merging, this is a whole system that is suddenly like kind of brand new, and the kinks are all getting worked out on both sides. So both the SAG side and the label side. Like I've never heard of a label tracking uses, because reuse fees are gravy. They don't keep the lights on in the building. It's the licenses, it's the record sales, it's everything else. So
no, but I think the licensing departments at the labels have to submit like how many licenses and where they've licensed over the course of a 6-month period. That's how the unions re-invoice the producers from those lists. You don't think that's the way it's working?
I mean, I just don't know that I've ever heard of that happening. Like, yeah. I know that that's the rule. I mean, that's the lore, so to speak. But as far as like someone actually doing that, I don't know. Lariana, have you ever seen any?
No. It's, it's the same thing, with the talent departments in an ad agency used to submit all this information to the unions. when the agencies started consolidating and centralizing their talent, they lost, that person that a producer could go to, or a music supervisor could go to and be like, hey, where is this spot being at? Is it still in rotation? Is it done? I got this, the artist is calling me asking, where their checks are. You used to be able to go to somebody. Now it's just like, it's so muddy and gray and convoluted. Mostly my guess is because SAG and AFTRA really haven't gotten their act together yet in this iteration of their business. That it's a Wild West again.
Okay.
I also feel like the incentive to self-report on that is pretty low. Just because you've got so many other things to do. This is not a priority internally at a studio, or I'm guessing it, any other company. It's not, it's just a bandwidth thing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
So if the unions have, if SAG-AFTRA only has 2 people doing all of these use fees, and AFM only has 3 people, how is this all being policed at all? I mean, it sounds like all they can.
It's catch as catch can. I mean, like, that's why even when you do get an invoice from the union, at least on the studio side, and it'll bounce around desks. Nobody knows what to do with that, because the production, the movie wrapped 4 years ago,
Right.
And then you have to go back and actually, number one, make sure the song was used. Was it that master? Was it, there are so many levels to it. And I mean, if that gets left on someone's desk, I don't know that the union is like knocking on anyone's door saying, pay us. And it's a problem, because there's lives behind those names, and it's, there's just no standard practice for it.
I also had several advertising people tell me that they were sort of chased by the union, but they had paid those fees. Like they had to sort of defend themselves and prove that they had paid the fee, a while ago, because the union decided like 5 years down the line, they might not have paid. So I think that goes both ways.
Yeah. I mean, as a SAG member, I've been overpaid on something and then called by the union and said, hey, you have to send that money back. So it's like, they're doing the best they can. I think somebody said, like, those are very, very busy 5 people. Like, yes, extremely, extremely busy, and extremely like every time you look at SAG, there are union issues being dealt with as members. Like AFM, you guys were talking about the AFM retirement is higher than, SAG, like, that pension fund. That was a hard one case, and the government had recently bailed them out in order to supplement and protect that pension fund. So that was like right at the start of COVID. Anybody who is an AFM member that had been paying into their pension for all these years suddenly had that risk of that pension fund being blown out. That was just right during COVID, and that was saved. That was protected. A lot of people in government fought for that and protected that. SAG is constantly in battle with itself with how much they're actually doing for its members. And this kind of thing sort of exposes the fact that, SAG needs to update its terms. It needs to update how its practices are. It needs to update where its focus is. It needs to provide easier ways for their artists to work and find work instead of making it harder for them. If you don't get points throughout the year as an artist, your healthcare goes away, and then you have to re-earn those points again. So there's so many issues that I think SAG, it's just coming to this perfect storm of where SAG, AFTRA, and especially after all this new media that has been plopped on us this year through COVID, people cutting the cord on cable and completely shifting their media and having to redefine what those media platforms are and how they're priced. it's the perfect storm for SAG to reconfigure and rebuild and make things easier for everybody. And I think these kind of conversations are really important because now it's something that we need to deal with. Our supervisors are, more and more independent supervisors are out there that need to know this information, and it needs to be clear cut.
I think we're reaching a crisis point, honestly, because it's gotten so complicated and there's so much production happening, and there has to be an easier system. And also, being billed 2 to 3 years later is not working for anybody. So I am going to show this video to the presidents of both of those unions and the MU, and I'm going to invite them to be participants with us to try to fix this system because it's broken. It's really, really broken. And that is the one thing I did learn from all these conversations. I hope tonight that we answered some of your questions, made you think about some opportunities of ways that you can resolve union fees in your productions. If we didn't answer your questions, please feel free to email me and we'll try to start some kind of a page to answer those. And I'll put my email address in the chat. And thank you for coming. For you East Coast people, it's 8:43, and thank you. It's been a long, long day for us. Really, thank you so much to Loriana and Celeste and to Patricia, Joseph, who was on the phone and texting and so on top of this whole panel for us. And to Lionel, who's visiting from Vienna. It's like 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning there. So really, thank you to everyone.